Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here. I am pleased to have you all join us for today's installment of Intermodal Analyzed. Larry Gross, the Intermodalist, is back with us to inform us with what's going on in Intermodal and what we might be able to take from that. Larry, as always, it's great to have you back, my friend. Thank you. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Larry Gross, the president and founder of Gross Transportation Consulting.
Well, thanks, Hal. And as always, appreciate the chance to be with you and with your audience. I really enjoy having the opportunity to make these presentations and appreciate that the IANA team has chosen to put forth this program. Hal made reference that maybe perhaps I'm going to delight the audience. Well, there's always a first time for that. I'm not sure if what I'm going to be showing you here is going to be characterized as delightful, but we'll do our best in the next half hour or so to try and cover the waterfront in terms of what's going on right now out in the North American intermodal world. Here's my contact info. If you have questions that are not answered in the course of the presentation or want to reach out for some reason, you can get me at that cell phone number or lgross@intermodalindepth.com. Hal mentioned that I am on Twitter and I use the handle Intermodalist. So with that, let's get going here. And here is the data off of the IANA ETSO database, equipment type, size, and ownership, as late as April. And just as a refresher, ETSO allows us to divide the intermodal market into the two main segments, international and domestic. International being also referred to as IPI, or Inland Point Intermodal. That is the movement of ISO intact containers, 20s, 40s, and 45s. And that's shown here in blue. Domestic containers, which are all but a handful, are 53s. There's still a few 48s that are running out there, primarily in solid waste service, as well as all TLFC, all trailers. And those numbers are presented in green. If you look on the left-hand side, you can see what the monthly numbers have been doing in terms of revenue moves per month. And what we define as a revenue move, it's entirely possible if it's a privately owned piece of equipment, in other words, a steamship line container or a domestic container owned by somebody other than a railroad, you might have revenue associated with it to the railroad, even if the container is moving empty. So it's not quite the same thing as measuring loaded containers, because there is some empty movements that are being captured in here. Now, if you have a rail-owned domestic container that's moving empty, no revenue associated with that, therefore it doesn't show up in these numbers. So if you look at the numbers for April and March, we saw a huge bounce back from February. February was a double whammy. It was calendar effect, or simply put, fewer working days in February than January, as well as the results of the polar vortex. So we saw this huge rebound in March. Of that roughly 20% rebound, about 15% of that was just calendar effect. There were 3 more working days in March than there were in February. It's about as big a change as you can possibly see between 2 months, just in terms of the number of working days. So the rebound was not quite as strong as you might see from this chart on the left, nor was February quite as bad as that chart might indicate. You had the polar vortex compounded by the short month. So let's focus on what's happened since then. And we saw a decline across the board from March to April. About 6% of that decline, or we would say there are 6% fewer working days in April than March. So that accounts for actually the bulk of the decline. And if you put that against the international numbers, we probably saw a little bit of an increase. And I'll cover that here in a minute. On the right-hand side are the year-over-year changes. And of course, right now, these numbers are astronomical. And I don't think they're particularly meaningful. We see a lot of mention of these huge year-over-year increases in the press. There's terms like freight apocalypse being tossed around. And frankly, I think a lot of that is just a little bit of hype. Certainly volume is strong, and I wouldn't say otherwise. But these numbers are not really indicative of much. If you go back to the left-hand chart here, you're going to see that the domestic year-over-year changes are going to really start to shrink, especially once we get into June and July. The year-over-year increases are going to dramatically go down, but that doesn't mean anything in terms of what's happening now. It only means what was happening a year ago. And it's going to take the IPI side another month before it joins the party, because back a year ago, we didn't see real increases start to happen until we get to July. So, I take these year-over-year numbers right now. They're interesting, but not particularly useful. So here's the detail by product line on what happened in April. The month-to-month numbers, and you can see they're all in red. That's because volume dropped off slightly from March to April. But you have these very large year-over-year increases across the board. And some of them are really jaw-dropping, like what's happening with regard to 53-foot trailers, as well as rail domestic containers. What we're comparing here is the depth of the domestic pandemic turndown. So, rail domestic containers were badly hurt because the automotive industry shut down. A lot of those rail domestic containers are moving in north-south traffic across the border to Mexico. That traffic was basically vaporized during the month or two of the pandemic lockdowns. So you have these huge year-over-year increases. They're statistically accurate, just not particularly terribly useful. So I mentioned the calendar effect, and I think that is a very important thing to keep an eye on. And what I'm doing here with these two charts is comparing, on the right-hand side, the calendar adjusted numbers, adjusted for working days, versus the monthly numbers. Now, adjusting for calendar effect is not quite the same thing as seasonally adjusted, because seasonally adjusted also takes into account the normal variations that we see from between, let's say, the depths of winter and peak season. So we're not doing that here. We're only adjusting for the number of actual working days, meaning typically weekdays, that are occurring in a month. And seasonally adjusted numbers can be very useful, but right now I'm a little bit leery of seasonally adjusted numbers. And the reason for that is because seasonally adjusted numbers are based on normal emphasis, normal seasonality. And when you have a situation that's as abnormal as what we have right now, where we're coming out of the economy is coming out of a medically induced coma, and we've never really experienced it before, it's not clear that normal seasonal factors apply. And I'll give you an example of that. There was a lot of press here last week because the job numbers were very weak or weaker than expected in terms of the number of new jobs that were added, 226,000 new jobs. But what's not really mentioned is that those numbers, that jobs number, is seasonally adjusted, which makes complete sense because, normally speaking, there are new jobs being created every April as a result of seasonal activity, seasonal hiring. And if we allow the numbers to be jerked around by that every year, they can be kind of misleading. But this year, it's really not clear how these seasonal adjustments are valid, or whether we've got something special going on. So, for instance, in April, it was actually, if you look at the unadjusted numbers, probably somewhere north of 750,000 jobs added. What I'm saying here is we need to be treating these seasonally adjusted numbers with a degree of caution right now, because of the unusual circumstances that we find ourselves in. So to get back to the moves per day chart here on the right, you can see that we had a period, an extended period, very unusual, from September through December, all the way through the fourth quarter, where volume was basically flat, which is an indication that the system was just working at capacity. You just couldn't move any more freight than you were moving. Now, we broke out of that in January on the IPI side and broke north in terms of revenue moves per day in January, saw a big increase. Then we got hit with the polar vortex, etc., knocked things back in February. Now, over the course of 2 months, we've fully recovered, and so we're back up to the level that we saw in January. And it does appear that from an IPI standpoint, the system has kicked into a little bit higher gear. The same cannot be said for domestic, because if you look there, domestic activity per working day began to decline in January, took a big drop in February, and we haven't made ourselves all the way back to where we were in the fourth quarter. So what is not clear to me at this point is whether this differential between, and I'll just show you how far we are from that green dashed line. Is that a market issue or is that an operational issue? I can't tell. Is it that there's less intermodal demand for domestic intermodal, or is it just that the system just is still bound up and we're still running at whatever capacity is right now in terms of box fleet or chassis or any of the other components, any one of which can be the weakest link in the intermodal chain? Or are we actually really seeing, I'll say, a little bit of a cooling of the very strong demand that we saw for domestic intermodal during the early part of the recovery? The AAR numbers give us a much more timely look. These are the numbers through mid-May, so just basically through a week ago Saturday. These numbers are put out every Wednesday morning. The left-hand side is North American intermodal originations, including all of North America. The right-hand side is just U.S. railroads. So this would include the 5 U.S. Class 1s, excluding CNCP and the Mexico railroads. So to me, what it looks like is we're starting to see at a very high level a little bit of a flattening of the growth rate, especially in the last couple of weeks. I mean, just like we were talking about with the monthly numbers, we're seeing these very large year-over-year increases. But there again, I don't really think that these are terribly meaningful, and I'll get back to that here towards the end of the presentation. I'll give you at the bottom here, the year-over-years for both the last week as well as the last 4 weeks. Not much difference between them, indicating a little bit of a plateau. Here are the same numbers for Canada and Mexico. You can see that the Canada, I'll flip back here for a minute. Take a look at the US numbers. They stayed up at a relatively high level, even right through the first quarter, with the exception of the polar vortex and before that, the holiday break. We look at the Canadian numbers, there definitely was a little bit of a more, I'll call it more normal turn down following peak season in first quarter. And then lately we've seen what could be regarded as a big seasonal uptick as we start to move into the busier freight season. But the overall difference between prior year is much, much smaller than in the US. And that's because the Canadian railroads were not as badly affected. This is CN and CP also includes their US operations, or as the AAR reports it, part of Canada. And then on Mexico, we've seen finally a breakout into positive territory with regard to the year-over-year changes. That's on the right-hand side in yellow is the number per week, and then the red bars are the year-over-year. So we saw a breakout into growth, but again, I'd say that was primarily a function of what was happening a year ago. You don't really see a lot of increase in terms of the overall level that we're operating at. Even the peaks there are relatively aligned. So it does look like still Mexico has still got a ways to go in terms of its overall recovery. Homing in on domestic container, we can divide the domestic container world into two fleets, the rail-owned fleet and the privately owned, being folks like Hunt, Schneider, Swift, UPS, etc. Rail, primarily UMAX, EMP, as well as the Canadian railroads, which operate sizable rail-owned fleets, and to a limited extent, the Mexican railroads. We saw a little bit stronger performance on the private side. It got more badly affected by the polar vortex and has since bounced back. If we look at it from a share standpoint, in other words, of the moves that are occurring, revenue moves that are occurring in domestic containers, what share of that is being accounted for by movement of private domestic containers? And that's what's shown here on the right. And you can see that in May of last year, at the depths of the downturn, private share was through the roof. And that was because the rail-owned container fleet, as I mentioned earlier, was so badly hurt by the shutdown of the automotive industry and other key sectors that rely on the rail domestic container fleet. Since then, things have kind of normalized. There has been quite a bit of variation. We saw, a pretty good bump up here in January when the rail fleet began to encounter some more difficulties. Since then, it's kind of returned to, I'll call it a more normal state, somewhere in the 71, 72% range, and you can see that here in these bar charts. On the trailer side, on the left-hand side, we're looking at the movements of what I call short trailers, anything 48 feet or less, and on the right-hand side are 53s. Not a lot of sequential growth happening, particularly on the 28s, which are the mainstay of the short trailer volumes. We also have 45s and 48s. If I were to show you the year-over-year changes for the 48s in particular, they're astronomical, because typically prior to the pandemic, the 48s were just a seasonal surge fleet that were brought out by the parcel carriers during the holiday season to help handle the big parcel surges that occurred normally in pre-pandemic times only during the peak holiday season. That surge fleet was reactivated early last year in July, and you can see that green line popping up in July. And since then, even going up a little higher because the surge fleet was expanded during peak season last year, and it hasn't really stopped moving. So we're seeing still some very, very large year-over-year increases. That will come to an end here when we get to July. Still big movements right now in terms of 53s, and very large increase in April versus prior year when it was badly hit by the pandemic. Here's the IPI situation, or the ISO container situation. And the basic message here that I want to say is that we are seeing a little bit of a change in mix with regard to ISO containers. A little bit of an eye chart here. I'm not sure you can read these numbers. What we're measuring on this right-hand chart is the share of IPI that's being accounted for by the three major container sizes: 20s, 40s, and then 45s. 20s are in a rust-colored, 40s are yellow, and the 45s are green. Well, the 45s are somewhere in the 1.6 to 2% range. They're a relatively minor player. But the big change has been in the 20-foot share, which was 24% back in May of last year, declined rapidly and steadily down to a low of 18.8% in October. Now, that is a big drop in what is normally a large number of containers. That a pretty significant change in the mix. And what I cannot tell you is whether this is a representative of what was happening out on the water in terms of international trade, or just that the 20s were not moving inland as frequently. And I still don't know the answer to that question. What I can say is that since October, 20-foot share has been coming back slowly but steadily, and the number in April is 20.6. So it's added almost 2% back in the last, 6 months. So perhaps we're starting to see I'll call it a normalization of that. It looks like this was a little bit perhaps of a pandemic effect, but definitely something to keep an eye on, because a lot of the export commodities tend to be heavy loading commodities, and they like 20-foot containers. I was not surprised to see some concerns over the availability of container capacity, ISO container capacity at inland points. If you're looking for a 20-footer, they were a little bit harder to find, I'm sure, in the fourth quarter of last year. There's some good news, I think, on the port productivity front. We're looking here at the number of loaded import and export TEUs. We saw a really nice jump up in March, which was essentially mostly hung on to in April. I think the drop that you see in April was purely calendar effect. And so we're maintaining at a very high level now in terms of productivity, which is simply how many TEUs are we being able to unload from all of those ships that are still floating out there and off the nation's ports. The other big nice message here is that finally in March, which is the latest data that we have available for exports, comprehensive data, we saw a real nice 20% uptick, breaking out of the rut that exports were caught in for the entire post-pandemic era. and actually moving slightly ahead of prior year for the first time in over 12 months. And you look at that red line, which is the total TEUs, and that was a new record in terms of total TEUs processed in March. And many of the individual port regions also set records. If you look on the right-hand side, we do see some outsized year-over-year increases, as was the case with intermodal movements in general. The imports starting to return to a more normal state, and I expect that will continue, although we won't really see those year-over-year increases begin to shrink meaningfully, I think, from here until we get to second quarter. If we look at the individual port regions, there's a couple that I want to point out. One is LA Long Beach, and what we're measuring here is the share of import TEUs that are being received by U.S. ports as well as those in Western Canada. And we saw this huge jump in the early part of the pandemic recovery in the third quarter of last year in LA Long Beach share as everybody tried to jam their way through. The message here is that situation has certainly normalized. Actually, if you look at the yellow line, which is the average of the preceding 12 months, LA Long Beach share has been a little bit below average for 3 out of the last 4 months. So it looks like people are beginning to sort of steer away and giving these ports a little bit of breathing room in order to work their backlogs down. The one that really has gotten my attention here in the last month is this Western Canada number, which is Prince Rupert and Vancouver. I was struck by this very unusual decline that we've seen so far in 2021 in their share. And when I looked into it further, it appears that the problem is solely due to reduction in Prince Rupert, which in April was 53% down from its December numbers. Now that may just be, I'll call it operational blank voyages, different sort of ocean carrier hijinks that are driving it down. I don't know why otherwise this would be occurring, perhaps congestion issues, but certainly something that got my attention last month. And I'd be interested to hear if any of the audience has opinions on that. Where a lot of growth has been occurring so far in the first quarter and in the first 4 months of 2021 has been in the Southeast, Atlantic, and Gulf Coast. And you can see those two areas presented here in terms of share. Again, the yellow line being the average of the preceding 12 months, and the red line is a 3-month moving average. And Southeast share has really grown quite significantly and is up at over 17.5%. A year ago, it was about 16.2. So that's a big change over the course of 12 months. And Gulf Coast share also is looking pretty strong. The drayage system right now, this is our drayage demand index. I'm just checking the time here. The drayage demand index is what we put together with our friend Jason Hilsenbeck at drayage.com, measuring the pressure that is being experienced in 21 major North American drayage markets. And the green line that you're seeing here is the composite number of all of those 21 markets. And let's just say at 377, we're in uncharted territory in terms of the tightness. You see what I'll put it in quotes, the normal kind of numbers ranges are on the left side. What is 100 here, what do we call average, was the average that we saw in the year 2017, right across that year. And now we are, over 3 times that in terms of pressure. Now, I think that once you get above 300, this measure starts to sort of lose meaning. It's not clear that 400 is a whole lot worse than 300. Or in some cases, and you see it there on the right, Savannah got up to 900. Well, that just means that there wasn't enough drayage capacity, and the shortage was so severe that people were just clicking like crazy, trying to find some source of dray power. 916 is so far off the charts, I don't even know how to absorb that. Charleston's also there. So right now, we saw that Southeast import share is up, And now we're seeing some of the effects of that in terms of a very, very tight drayage capacity situation. And this is also being exacerbated by some of the actions of the railroads in terms of impeding, or I'll say throttling the amount of volume that's moving into some of these ports. So for instance, the number of containers that are being accepted in Memphis bound for places like Savannah and Atlanta is being metered. And as a result, Memphis is also seeing some really high drayage numbers. Also, the cotton is moving. A lot of these individual markets have their individual stories. It's nothing that unusual to see individual markets that have, at one point or another, some degrees of tightness. So it is somewhat unusual, I think, to see so many of them moving in sync. And this is just another example of how just about every piece of the intermodal supply chain now is under severe pressure. One of the areas also that is we're seeing the effects of that is on the rail network. I always have to preface these numbers by saying I don't think that they're particularly useful, and by that I'm talking about the average intermodal train speeds as they're running between intermodal terminals. This is a sort of an indicator of the fluidity of the rail system. And the only real time that I think this number is useful is when you see big deviations from the norm. And that's certainly the case that we're seeing right now. If you look at the red line, which is the average, weighted average intermodal train speed of all of the US railroads that report to the STB, and that includes the US operations of the Canadian railroads, we are not covering ourselves with glory here. The red line is considerably below, way below the yellow line, which was what was happening last year at this time. Now, I don't think that's particularly meaningful because last year the network was wide open without a lot of traffic. So the trains were really running fast. And I don't really pay too much attention to that. But what I do pay attention to is where the red line is relative to the blue line, because the blue line is the average performance over the previous 5 years. And normally, you could see that when we hit the polar vortex back there in about week 9, things went into the tank and they have not recovered. And frankly, I don't see any signs of acceleration in the numbers. This is through, a week and a half ago. It's disappointing because supposedly precision scheduled railroading was supposed to make the system more resilient and less vulnerable to the kinds of shocks that we're seeing. And frankly, I don't really see any signs of that in these numbers. If anything, it looks like the system has been more vulnerable and has proven not capable so far of recovering from the disruptions that occurred back in February. And these numbers right now, you can see, are very close. The red line is very close to the lowest line, which was 2019 in green. Unless we start to see some improvement here in the next week or two, we're going to go into, I'll say, these will be the lowest numbers ever recorded in the last 10 years for those particular weeks of the year. And there is, as you can see from that blue line, a normal seasonality here in terms of speeds ebb and flow across the course of the year in a normal fashion. We're just not seeing that so much this year. So the last item that I want to talk about is to try and put some of this volume into a bit better context. And here again, what I'm saying here is don't pay a lot of attention to the year-over-year changes that you're seeing right now. And here are two ways that I'm presenting the data. On the left-hand side is the AAR North American Intermodal Originations by week, 4-week moving average, so we take a little bit of the volatility out of it. The red line is this year, 2021, and we've gone through week 19 so far, and we compare that to the preceding 3 years. 2020 is in blue, 2019 is in green, and 2018 is in white. Of course, you could see there's a huge differential depending on which year that you're comparing to. And we make that explicit on the right-hand side here by comparing each week of 2021 with the same week in the preceding 3 years. So the blue line is 2021 versus 2020, the first 19 weeks. The white line is 2018, the green line is versus 2019. And right now, if you look at the right-hand side of this right chart, you can see that the comparisons with 2020, the blue, are way up in the north of 25%, which is strictly a function of what was going on a year ago at this time. But if we look at 2018, which is, I'll say, probably the last normal year, put that term in quotes, but before tariff disruptions and all of these other changes that are occurring, the increases are far, far more modest, somewhere in the 5 to 8% range. And if you look at 2018, more like 5 to 5.5% range. Now, keep in mind that this is a 5.5% growth over a 3-year period. So what that means is that volume has grown at 1.8% compound annual growth rate. And that's not a giant amount of growth. So a question worth asking is, why has the system been brought to its knees? And it's not just a story of growth. Now, some of it is pandemic effect. Some of it is not this sort of quick ramp up and its ability to cope with this very rapid ramp up that occurred. And certainly once you get behind the 8 ball, once you get congested, it is just extremely hard for the system to dig its way out. But I think it's also an equally legitimate question to say, how do we as a collectively make the intermodal network more resilient? Because there's always something happening out there. There's either port disruptions or labor issues or tariff issues and weather, hurricanes, polar vortex, you name it. There are always going to be disruptions. And if every time there's a disruption, we say, well, this was an abnormal event, who would have forecast that? Then we're never going to get to the point where intermodal will be able to fulfill its full potential. So I don't necessarily, I think, have the answer. I just think that we've demonstrated an ability, very good ability, to follow the market down and maintain capacity, shed capacity when necessary. That's a whole lot easier, it seems, than adding the capacity back when it's needed. And when volume really comes up a little bit faster, we as an industry seem to have a very, very tough time dealing with that. And here's the results. If you look at market share, we saw, and the green, each of these is important for different reasons. The green is domestic, and that is the share of 500-mile and greater truck, dry-van, and reefer type traffic. And this is the share that intermodal movements and domestic equipment accounts for. And you can see that there was this tremendous jump up in third quarter of 2020 as we came rocketing out of the downturn, and all of the factors favored intermodal. Unfortunate part is we have not, looks like, been able to hang on to those gains. We saw a little bit of a decline in Q3. That was Q2. That was the big jump. And then quite a substantial decline in Q1 because we weren't able to grow. We had capacity issues. In the meantime, truck freight is growing. So I would say the message here is that there has not really been any fundamental change in the competitiveness of intermodal versus over the road. We see that decline that occurred in 2019, which I would attribute to PSR modifications and network simplification, combined with the ending of the ELD capacity crisis on the over the road side. Things seem to settle into a new normal at about 6.5% before jumping up as a result of the pandemic recovery. And now we look like we're back on our way down. There is always discussion in the press about driver shortage, and drivers are always going to be difficult to find. But the only time that we have a shortage of capacity with regard to drivers is when we have step function changes in demand that the trucking industry has a tough time adapting fast enough. That's what happened with the LDs. It's what happened here with the pandemic recovery. And so that's why the truck capacity became so tight. Going forward, until there's another disruption, I think the trucking industry is going to be able to find enough drivers. And the reason I think that is because they always are able to find enough drivers. They'll certainly have to pay them more. So from a rate perspective, it looks pretty rosy. But in terms of, if it's not a good intermodal strategy to just sit back and say, there's going to be tight capacity on the highway, it's going to force volume back onto the railroad, back into intermodal. Because I don't think that's necessarily what's going to happen until there's the next disruption. On the right-hand side, you could see the decrease that occurred in IPI movements as a percentage of total North American long-haul movements. And they went down starting in 2018, bottomed out in 2020. I think a lot of that is actually west to east port transfer, going from a intermodal friendly landing on the West Coast, percentage of that shifting to the East Coast. That's a much less intermodal friendly place for freight to arrive. Then we saw that reverse here and during the recovery, much more volume because of the need for speed to the market coming into the West Coast. Intermodal saw a benefit there. Again, I don't know that this is going to endure. I suspect that we're going to start to see, again, some retreat from that as we go back into more normal times. So to wind it up from a short-term perspective, I think throughout Q2, freight's going to still be very strong. We've got a good backlog of import cargo waiting to be moved. The economy certainly looks like it's going to be growing pretty rapidly. The shift to service is underway. That's not an intermodal or freight-friendly shift. 70% of the U.S. economy is consumer, and a good chunk of that is services. This is spending that hasn't been able to be done over the course of the pandemic, and now I would say there's quite a lot of pent-up demand. So maybe some of that disposable income that the consumers had, a greater percentage of that is going to be directed at services, and that's not necessarily good for freight. But at the same time, we are going to continue to see really strong growth, and it's a question of the balance between those two will determine what the demand for an overall intermodal or overall freight movements will be. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of breathing room for us to catch our breath and get more recovery on the operational side. We're going to have to continue to do whatever recovery we do under pressure because the volume is still going to be coming through. Having said that, I really don't expect, when we look back, we won't see, I'll call it a normal looking peak season versus where we are today. Instead, I think we're just going to see sort of a continuation in relatively high levels across through peak. And so it will feel like things are, let's say, a little less peaky than they normally would be. And there's no question in my mind but that the year-over-year increases are going to be compressed as we get to this year's peak season. But having said that, I think for the reasons that I mentioned, driver pay, higher cost of diesel, and general tightness across the supply chain, the rate environment is going to be very strong on the over-the-road side, and that means the rate environment is going to be very strong on the intermodal side as well. So with that, here's my shameless plug. I do all this plus a lot more every month in my Intermodal In-Depth analytical report, which also has weekly updates based on the AAR numbers. And we'd love to get all of the listeners as subscribers, and you can give it a try for an individual subscription for as little as $200 for 6 months, or a corporate subscription, which gets you up to 20 individuals for $275. So please, everybody click through and subscribe, and you'll make my day. So with that, Hal, I guess I'll turn the mic back over to you and look forward to receiving questions from the audience. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Insightful as always, generated some good feedback already, and I'm sure we'll have a little bit more as we move through the question session. So we will jump right in with a couple of questions around clarity and why you've chosen to approach the numbers. You know, what's your thinking, what's your logic there? The first is about your notion of adjusting for workdays. And the question there is, why do you do that? And the questioner says some railroad terminals and intermodal trains run on Saturday, and some are even running on Sundays. And larger BCOs have their DCs open at least a little on the weekends. What's the thinking behind your workday adjustments, considering that not everybody's on a Monday through Friday schedule?
I would say I absolutely agree with the listener. A Monday is not the same thing as a Friday even, because Friday there are more outbound shipments on Friday, more receiving shipments on Monday. So even within the week, there are differences, and we do try and take account of that. And a Saturday is not worth zero; it's worth a fraction of a Friday. A Sunday is worth even a little bit less, but still something. It's not zero. And then of course you get into the whole holiday effect, which is where this really becomes most useful,
Right.
because some months have a lot of holidays, some don't, and you have holidays that, well, let's say Thanksgiving is always on a Thursday. There's always the day after Thanksgiving, which has its value, not a normal Friday by any stretch, much smaller than a normal Friday. But there are some other holidays that move around in the days of the week. And it makes a big difference, for instance, if a July 4th is on a Tuesday or if it's on a Monday. Because if it's on a Tuesday, you kind of get a 4-day weekend thing going. And that Monday volume is always going to be less than a normal Monday. And we actually take that all into account when we look at these working days per month and try and level that out. Now, by necessity, it's an average number. And that's why I don't, you would need have a totally different number for Mexico or a totally different number for Canada. They have different holidays season, different, but I don't have access to that data. So it's based on the US situation. But it's a much more complicated, I kind of glossed over it. It's a very involved calculation, and it takes a lot of that sort of volatility out of the numbers and helps explain a lot of what's going on when you see these sort of strange month-to-month gyrations.
Makes a lot of sense. I'm sure it's more an algorithm rather than a calculation, probably based on all of those factors that you're talking about. Here's one just to follow up on that, Larry. And they're asking, on the revenue per average working day, are you using the 5-day or the 7-day week?
It's a 7-day week, but there are roughly 5 working days per week. But it depends on how the calendar falls, right? How many weekend days or how many holidays do you have in the course of that month? So it changes. Every month is different. There are variations not only from month to month, but from year to year, depending on how the calendar works. So you really do need to get down into the weeds on that.
It makes a lot of sense. Here's one around, I'm trying to distill this down, but basically, we had seen since the expansion of the canal a movement to larger imports coming into the East Coast. With COVID, it seems like and consumer buying behavior has really refocused a lot of the imports into Southern California. Do you expect that to hold, or are you seeing any indications of perhaps things moving back to a more distributed model as we kind of dig our way out of this COVID-fueled sort of challenging spot we're in currently?
Yeah, no, I think it is returning to whatever the new normal is. Okay, we already are seeing LA, as I mentioned, LA Long Beach share go back to what it was. So you had this sort of spike up, which was a function of this need for speed to market. And everybody decided at the same time that the fastest way to market was to come in across the Pacific, go into LA, intermodal beyond. And normally that is the fastest way to market, but not when everybody decides to do it at the same time. So that's where a lot of that LA congestion came from, plus, of course, pandemic effects and short working crews and, all of those other issues. I see things, going back to a more East Coast share. We see that big increase in share in the Southeast in particular. Northeast is no slouch, just not quite as strong. You've got new intermodal services that are being instituted from the Southeast into the Midwest, and some of the volume that previously was coming into, let's say, LA is going to come into Savannah and they perhaps move it up towards Chicago or Charleston. More inland port activity there. And then, of course, you're going to have, I think, a movement. This has been put on pause during the pandemic, but you're going to see a movement away from China. There's no question in my mind about it. And where is that stuff going to move? Well, a lot of it's moving to Southeast Asia, South Asia, India. A lot of that volume, the short route, is into the East Coast via the Suez. And so you're going to start to see a resumption, I think, of that west to east drifting of volume.
And this one sort of follows on that a little bit, at least, which is as things normalize or new normalize, or a new word to talk about, what sort of a common stasis is going to be as we move forward, if there is such a thing. This questioner is saying it's looking like the vessel congestion and unloading delays might continue into late June or July from the West Coast. If that occurs, do we see the volumes, the transcontinental volumes, kind of obviously they're going to continue on the rails to be pretty peaky. Any notion of when things might return to a more balanced approach?
Well, I mean, everything that I've been reading about LA Long Beach says that they've been successful in recent weeks at working the backlog of vessels down. That backlog is sort of moving down fairly steadily. Whether that will continue is dependent on their productivity, which seems to be they're getting their arms around it, as well as how much more volume is coming in. How strong are the trans-Pacific imports that are still flowing into the situation?
Yeah,
it was a very interesting article in the Journal of Commerce here in the last couple of days, talking about that one of the biggest impediments to productivity on the West Coast right now is railcar supply. And if you look at the number of days that import containers are dwelling on the terminal before they exit towards their destination, import containers, it's somewhere in the vicinity, I'm doing this from memory, of 3.5 days for volume that's moving out by highway, and 11.5 days for volume that's moving out by rail. And so so the industry, the intermodal sector, holds its destiny in its hands in terms of its ability to sort of get that number down to a more reasonable level. That amount of dwell that's occurring in these Pacific import terminals, port terminals, is just clogging things up and reducing their ability to process. So, that this is all part of the same picture.
Yeah, and this listener kind of makes a similar point. Could the outsized growth of IPI relative to domestic be contributing to the slower intermodal train velocities, which is sort of a question and a statement, I guess?
Yeah, I would say typically, I mean, to use in jargon, an ocean container train doesn't move as fast as a Z train, a priority intermodal train. So there may be a little bit of a mixed thing going there. I have no ability to sort of tease that out of the data. But when we're looking at I would say that the differences are of a magnitude that can only account for part.
Yeah.
Also, intermodal is not. I mean, if you look at the other train types, automotive, whatever, they're all down. So I don't think it's an intermodal mix specific issue.
Right. In terms of the calculations, the drayage demand index, which I still think is super cool, and I applaud you and Jason for putting that together. So in terms of the calculations for that, could you talk a little bit about that, and what are the components that kind of go in to help build that?
It's a very simple calculation. And so, I don't make claims in terms of its accuracy. It's strictly, I'll call it one of those candle in a dark room indicators. And all we're doing there is we're measuring the number of clicks by market of people looking for intermodal dray capacity. And if we look at the average number of clicks per day in 2017 and compare the clicks last week to that, if it's 3 times the number, that's a level of 300. And if it's 9 times the number, like in Savannah, that's 900. Now, there's not a lot of precision to that number, but it is a very useful number because 300 is definitely more pressure than 200. And frankly, you look back across now 4 years worth of data, 5 years worth of data, we've never seen clicks at the level that it is now. So I think it's a pretty good indicator of pressure. And when you see the kind of numbers that we're seeing in some of these markets, it's just an indication that that market is getting into its upper dysfunctionality or sort of danger zone.
No, it makes sense. I think we might have time for like one more quick question. So year over years can be really challenging based on whatever happened the previous year. So it seems like 2018 was a particularly volatile year with a lot of, sort of a more volume than 2017. 2019, you were dealing with some trade wars,
Buying issues, right?
Buying issues, Lunar New Year,
Right.
and then it kind of ran into the pandemic, which kind of sucked up a lot of 2019. So we're at this point, we're looking at almost 3 years that are sort of like asterisk years. So is there a way to make a comparison with previous performance that takes some of that into account?
Well, I mean, that becomes a real judgment call. A simple approach is just to say, okay, and this is really a valid approach, is just we'll take the average of the last 3 years and just say, okay, now where are we relative to that? So much of this becomes now sort of a little bit of an art, because you're looking at different years and, well, okay, Q4 of 2018 was inflated because people were struggling to beat the tariffs that ended up not being applied. And, so you really need to, whenever you look at comparisons, no matter with what year, you have to go back to that preceding year that you're looking at and say, okay, now what do I need to know about that year that helps me interpret what I'm seeing? I'm afraid there's no real easy way to do it. In a business where as I said, there's always something happening. There's always a special situation. We don't seem to have normal years anymore. It's our burden and my burden as an analyst to sort of keep all of that in mind. And the whole job here is to make judgments as to where we're going. Where we're going, I think, is towards diminishing growth. And the thing that we all should be focusing on now is not year-over-year numbers, it's sequential numbers. And by that I mean, what is May going to look like relative to April and June going to look like relative to May? And that's because that's what we really feel. That's what we really feel. The year-over-year numbers are just a way of kind of expressing it. But, the question is volume going to go up or down from where we are now? And so that is the challenge as a forecaster that we deal with.
It's an art for sure. Some would say a black art, definitely a challenging art for sure. And we really appreciate you doing it. And as I said before, I certainly appreciate you doing it, so I don't have to, but you really help us out and generate a lot of questions. We had a lot of great questions from the audience today. Thank you to them for their participation. If folks are interested in digging into where a lot of the data comes from that Larry talked about, you can visit intermodal.org and check out the data and statistics products. We have the ETSO database, which is the full enchilada. We also have the Volume Analyzer, which helps you navigate that in a really kind of a user focused way, which is a nice little tool. So I would encourage you to go check that out. You can also just email us at info@intermodal.org. We have a full program of webinars that is going on this year, the Intermodal Adapts program. So if you're interested in those, this is part of that series. But if you're interested in some of the other things that we're doing, in addition to the Intermodal Analyzed series, head on over to intermodal.org and check out the education tab. I just want to point out one other thing. Intermodal Expo this September, it is happening. So if you are in the business, we want to see you back in Long Beach in September. So head on over to intermodalexpo.com, or you can go to intermodal.org. Either way, you can get information on what the dates are, what the provisional program is starting to look like, register, book your hotel, all that good stuff. With that, I will say thank you very much to everybody for participating, Larry, for all your hard work.